All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're still talking about our pollinator week, and we're going to continue doing that for just a few more days. I was going to come live yesterday, but it was super hot here. And when I went in the group, there wasn't very many people active in the group. So I decided to move it till today, and I hope that's okay with you. And hopefully you're here and you're watching. We're going to talk today about nectary flowers that you might want to consider planting in your garden. In your vegetable garden for sure, because of course planting pollinator flowers is going to attract more pollinators to your garden, which is going to give you better vegetable yields. Now, there are a few vegetable plants that rely heavily on pollinators in order to produce food. Those are the ones like the squash plants and the melons and the cucumbers. And then, of course, all of our fruit trees and all of our fruits like strawberries and raspberries rely heavily on pollinators. And in fact, a lot of them rely heavily on native pollinators. So even more than honeybees. So it's a really good idea if you want high fruit yields and high squash yields and a few other yields, or if you're trying to save seed in your garden, that you attract pollinators as well. Now, some statistics that you might not know. 70% of the world's plants depend on bee pollination in order to produce seed. So even if you buy your seed every year, pollinators are still essential so that you can have seed to buy. Because if we have a decrease in pollinator population, that means less seed. And when you go to order seed and you see crop failure, a lot of times it's the weather, but often it can be a lack of pollinators. 30% of all the food that we buy in the grocery store depends on pollinators. Now, the ones that don't, like grains or grasses, they're wind pollinated. So we will still have our grains and grasses. In fact, we'll still have our grapes but we won't have a lot of our vegetable oils. We won't have our fruit if there is no bee pollination or pollinator pollination. So 30% of the food in the grocery store depends on pollinators. Now, the interesting thing about that is just planting flowers in your garden doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have pollinators, because a lot of the flowers, especially the hybrid flowers, they lack some of the things that pollinators need. They might lack pollen if they are bred for the florist industry, or they might not have rich nectar, especially if they lack fragrance. Sometimes flowers are bred to be just beautiful and they lack fragrance. And often if they don't have fragrance, they also don't have nectar. So only 10% of flowering crops are actually visited by bees. That statistic surprised me. And only about 5% of native plants are visited by bees. And typically, most landscapes do not sustain pollinators or attract pollinators. So your garden might be the only garden in your entire neighborhood that pollinators can get what they need to thrive. And that's pretty important when so much of our food is dependent on pollinators. So that's a good reason to learn which plants pollinators can thrive with. So let's talk about the nectary glands of flowers. That's found in the very depth of the flower. And that's actually what the bees or butterflies or hummingbirds need, is that nectar. That nectar is high in sugar, and it is the sustaining thing. And often there's little bugs in it. So when you talk about hummingbirds, they're not just taking the nectar, they're also feeding on the little bugs that are inside, also feeding on the nectar. So some bees or pollinators have a proboscis that allows them to get deep into a flower. Other ones, their proboscis is smaller and they need shallower flowers. So when we're looking at flowers to attract pollinators, we need to also take into account the shape of the flower. For instance, hybrid tea roses. Hybrid tea roses are not great for pollinators because they have a lot of petals. And when roses are bred, the, okay, what is it called? The pistil that holds all of the pollen is in the center of the flower. And when roses are bred, some of those pistils become petals and they're not available to hold pollen for pollinators. So bees have a really hard time actually pollinating some of the roses that are hybrid roses that have a lot of petals. Now, the type of roses that are good for bees are the ones that open all the way and have a lot of anthers and pistils in the middle of the flower that they can roll around in and gather the pollen. So those are going to be your native roses, the ones that only have 1 row or 2 rows of petals, not the ones that have multitudinous petals. So those are things to think about when you're planting roses for pollinators. You want to pick a rose that doesn't have a lot of petals, maybe just 1 or 2 rows of petals, and has a lot of pollen in the middle. I've actually seen my honeybees hit the middle of a rose and then do a roll to just cover their entire body. And then they stuff their pollen sacs with the pollen, and bumblebees will do the same thing. They really need that pollen because they use the pollen to feed their young. Also, those happen to be the flowers that are very high in nectar. And the nectar glands in those roses that have high scent are the ones that the pollinators are going to be attracted to. Another shape of flower is the flat disc. Now, a lot of those are in the Asteraceae family, the sunflower family, and you'll recognize it. Those are the dandelions. Those are the sunflowers. Those are the, let's see, Asteraceae. So an Asteraceae flower might have a tube out. So it's made up of a lot of actually flowers in the middle, and they might be ray flowers or they might be disc flowers. So if you think about a sunflower has disc flowers in the very center, and if you look really closely, there are a lot of little tiny tubes, and then they have ray flowers along the outside. And if you watch bees pollinate a sunflower, there's actually a change as the bees work their way around the disc. There's a change in the shape of the flowers. And if you pay attention, you can see it. Now, those ray flowers and disc flowers in the Asteraceae family are very attractive to pollinators, because when a pollinator comes to that sunflower head or the dandelion head, there is a lot of nectar, because there's actually hundreds of flowers in that single flower that our eye sees. And so those are very attractive. So one of the best things you can do for pollinators is to plant a lot of Asteraceae family plants. That includes sunflowers, dandelions. Allow your dandelions to grow, of course. Don't weed kill them. Goldenrod, daisy, aster, echinacea is in this family. Yarrow is in this family. And again, lots of flowers within a single flower, which means lots of nectar and lots of pollen. Helenium, chrysanthemum, dahlia, marigolds, calendula, coneflower, cosmos, zinnia, wormwood, yarrow. These are all Asteraceae family plants that are really great for pollinators because they have a lot of nectar and they have a lot of pollen, because each flower is actually a lot of flowers inside the one flower. And then something you might not have thought about, but lettuce is also in this family. And if you don't have a lot of open flowers, letting some of your lettuce go to seed when the weather gets hot can give your pollinators something to feed on. It can also give you seed for lettuce next year, and you might end up naturalizing some lettuce in your garden, which is a good thing. So that's the disc flowers and the ray flowers from the Asteraceae family. Very high in nectar, very high in pollen, very good for pollinators. One drawback, though, is that a lot of these are later in the season. And when we're trying to plant for pollinators, we're looking for to try to sustain them, because our garden might be the only garden that sustains pollinators during the growing season. And so what we're looking for is a way to sustain them throughout the season. So there's never a time when there's not something that they can gather pollen from or feed on. And remember, we've talked already about different kinds of pollinators. We've got honeybees, we've got bumblebees, we've got native bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds. And they all have a little bit different needs, although there's some crossover. So you're looking at flowers that can sustain them throughout the season. And that means you want to try to manage your garden so that there's always something in bloom, and that thing in bloom always has pollen and always has nectar for them. So one of the ways we can do that is by letting some of our garden plants go to seed. For instance, if you planted radishes and then it got hot, you'll probably notice that your radishes are starting to bolt. Allowing a few radishes to go to seed will give a lot of brassica family flowers for your pollinators to feed on. And they really do love the brassicas. Native bees and honeybees love the brassicas. My butterflies will feed on them. And again, they might go to seed for you, and you might end up with a perennial brassica crop from the reseeding. One thing though, that's probably not seed you want to save unless you're growing microgreens, especially if your bok choy bolted, for instance. That's probably not great seed to save to have a sustaining crop of bok choy, but it's great for pollinators, and it's you can certainly collect the seed and use it for microgreens. And another plant in the brassica family is nasturtium, actually. The flowers are not quite brassica flowers, but the cabbage butterfly will feed off of a nasturtium as well. So there's got to be some brassica type, at least chemical in the leaves. Nasturtiums are great. They have a long blooming season. They have a lot of nectar, and they have those tubular flowers. Let me talk about the flower shape while we've got it. I sort of started, but I got off on a tangent on the Asteraceae. Sorry about that. When you're looking at flowers, hummingbirds, you probably know, love red flowers. So they're attracted to red flowers, but they also look for tubular flowers. So if you have plants in your garden with that tubular shape, like for instance, fuchsias, bee balm, those are going to be very attractive for your hummingbirds in the garden. And if you're trying to attract hummingbirds and create a hummingbird sanctuary in your garden, those are the ones you want to rely on. Those tubular flowers like bee balm, mint family plants specifically, and also some of those tubular flowers. For instance, lilac. Lilac is a tubular flower. All of the mint family plants are tubular flowers. With the hummingbird's long beak, they go right into the plant, and that's great for them. Another pollinator that really likes tubular flowers is the bumblebee. And the bumblebee will actually bite a flower to get it to open and to bloom sooner so that it can feed on those. I notice in my garden, I have a lot of comfrey plants. I use them as a cut and come again mulch, and I leave some to go to flower as well. And those flowers are totally covered in bumblebees. They get right up into the center of those flowers. And hummingbirds as well, like the comfrey flowers in my yard. And so those tubular flowers are very attractive to the pollinators that have a long proboscis or a long beak. I have noticed that my honeybees don't so much, they're not so much attracted to those flowers. They seem to prefer the flatter flowers and the more open flowers. I'm not sure why that is. I have noticed, the wider tubular flowers like my hollyhocks and my marshmallow, honeybees and the bumblebees and the hummingbirds like those. So if you have a larger flower with a lot of dominant pollen anthers, those flowers are attractive to a wider variety of species. Let's talk about flower color. We did mention that hummingbirds like red. Bees like blue flowers. And another tubular flower that's blue is delphinium. Delphinium is toxic to humans, so you don't want to use it for medicine or anything like that, but it's a beautiful flower. Again, it has a lot of nectar, a lot of pollen, and one plant will have a lot of small flowers. So that makes it very attractive. Delphiniums are blue often. I think there might be other colors. I'm not sure. My delphiniums are blue, and they're often covered in bumblebees, and also the honeybees like them. I haven't seen so much butterflies on them, but definitely bumblebees. Last year we had some queen bumblebees. I guess we've had them before, but it's the first time that I've seen queen bumblebees, and we literally had a dozen queen bumblebees all over the delphiniums for about a month in August. So they have a lot of nectar and they have a lot of pollen, and they come back year after year. So it's something that we don't have to work to achieve. They're perennial and they pretty much take over a garden bed. So you want to give them lots of room. And again, lots of nectar. So in conclusion, what you're looking for is flowers that will bloom over a long season, like the delphiniums, and flowers that have a lot of small flowers on one stem, and open flowers with lots of pollen. So using a lot of the hybrid flowers is not such a great idea if you're trying to attract pollinators, because they have more petals, they have, but they might lack nectar, they might lack pollen. And so instead of looking at hybrids, you want to go for the old-fashioned cottage garden type of flowers for pollinators. And again, hummingbirds prefer red, although they do feed on other plants too. And bees love blue. So if you can offer them blue flowers, pansies, delphiniums, those plants are great. One thing I wanted to talk about was the pea family. Now the pea family, interestingly, does not need bee pollination in order to produce fruit. So if you have like bush beans or pole beans or runner beans growing, or even lupins growing, or sweet peas, you will get flowers and fruit and seed, whether or not bees pollinate them. But bees do like the tubular flowers, and they do have nectar for bees. So just because bees are not necessary for pollination doesn't mean the flowers aren't useful in your garden. So that's something to think about as well. And of course, lupins, Texas bluebonnets, those kinds of pea family plants. They're also nitrogen fixers. They don't need a lot of fertility in your yard or your garden. So you can put them in an out of the way space where they're not going to interfere with your planting, maybe on the border where you're not feeding them, and they will thrive and also offer nectar for pollinators. Are there any questions? Hi, Joe. Thanks for coming. So again, we talked about the types of flowers that you want to have in your garden for pollinators. You want a long season of flowers, ones that bloom at different times. Ideally, one plant will have many flowers, and those flowers will contain both pollen and nectar. And you also want flowers that will bloom over a long season. And the Asteraceae family, your dandelions, your daisies, your cosmos, sunflower, those kinds of plants offer that, as well as the mint family plants like mint and motherwort, and many of your medicinal herbs will offer that as well. This is not an exhaustive list. Of course, there are many other plant families that offer what pollinators need. The key is to find plants over a long season. Early spring, you can use bulbs. Crocuses offer both pollen and nectar in the early spring. Some of the early spring. Tulips and daffodils, not so much, but the hyacinths, grape hyacinths, the smaller hyacinths also offer nectar and pollen. The plants that are fragrant tend to have what the pollinators need. So a fragrant plant generally has nectar. It's the nectar you're smelling when you're talking fragrance. So I hope you found that helpful. We're coming to the end of Pollinator Week. The official end of Pollinator Week was yesterday, but we're going to extend it because we have some more fun planned. And I want to give people a chance to take the quiz. The quiz is available right now. The link is in the group and you can take that quiz. It's kind of fun. There's just 15 questions. Most of them are pretty easy. And if you've been paying attention and playing the scavenger hunt, you already know the answers, so it's not going to be too difficult. And you can take the quiz as many times as you want. All right, I hope you found that helpful, and I'll talk to you in the group. Bye-bye.